Good afternoon, everybody. We are starting the session on the definition of basic income. And we will start with pre-recorded remarks by the former co-chair and the first chair of the Basic Income Earth Network. She's also a very prolific author and someone who's been writing about basic income for a very long time. Professor of political theory at the University of York. Recorded remarks by Louise Haag. Please play.
I'm giving from Britain. I'm sorry I couldn't be there today to join you all in Seoul. But I'm going to talk today about the justice and feasibility of basic income in times of crisis. And I'm going to talk about what we can learn from recent crises, specifically COVID, about basic income in a wider systemic sense. Because we tend to think that the feasibility of basic income is variable, and what we can learn from the crisis is about feasibility, but that the justice of basic income is fixed. And we may have different views about what the justice case for basic income is, but that this is sort of somewhat separate, and the feasibility comes afterwards. But to my mind, the justice of basic income really forms part of developmental justice generally. Basic income is not just on its own, and the feasibility of this form of justice is linked with developmental governance. And of course, these arguments are essentially the arguments of my book from 2029. And so what does it mean? Well, I think it means that I don't think basic income can be just in the same way in a neoliberal society, where in essence it's propping up structural injustice, as it might be in societies with more extensive solidaristic arrangements. And so you might say, in counter to this, well, if the basic income is high, in theory, what does it matter what the rest of society looks like? Isn't the point of a basic income and not only that it should be high enough to allow us to choose what to do, but that anyone can choose, we can then get together and interact with each other and create the sort of society that we want. But I think it's evident that the basic income will never be high under neoliberalism. And we live in the era of neoliberalism, we live in the realm of neoliberalism, even if we don't live in a homegrown neoliberal society. So that's another way in which I think entirely divorcing feasibility from justice gets quite difficult. And so both systemically and in terms of outcomes for individuals, basic income is not equally just. And I think COVID helped us see these relationships more clearly, not that they were not there before, but in a dynamic situation. Some of the relationships that I'm thinking about are brought out into the open. So what developmental justice is, first of all, is complex. It's linked with having one's needs met in terms of human development by the institutions of the society, how they are progressively structured and designed. And so when it comes to COVID, the degree economic security was reliable and commensurate with needs at such a time for different groups is a good indicator of the state of developmental justice in the society. While developmental governance, on the other hand, refers in very general terms to planned and long-term approaches to the design of institutions and policies, and for government to have and to exercise this capability, which incidentally I think is associated with a propensity to try and aim for lowering inequality in society. When government doesn't have developmental capabilities, that propensity, as well as that capacity, of course, is much weaker. So I'm going to argue that countries with developmental governance were better able to do justice to people under COVID, and there are lessons for basic income there. So to illustrate the significance of developmental capability, I'm going to make 5 points in relation to COVID, about neoliberalism and versus developmental governance, about employment outcomes, about forms of economic security coverage, about innovations in income security systems during COVID, and then I'm going to draw some conclusions. And I'm going to concentrate on rich countries that are heavily neoliberalized, on the one hand, including Britain, and others, on the other hand, with strong developmental capabilities, including Korea and Nordic states. These cases, of course, also happen to be in economic terms some of the worst and best COVID performers, not only in economic terms, also in health, but I'm going to focus on the economy. So in relation to COVID, I want to focus on two aspects of developmental governance capacity including government-level coordination, and secondly, risk pooling. And this includes levels of tax and GDP, but also government-supported systems of social savings that in different ways enhance the ability of society or groups in society to transparently co-govern and exercise some kind of democratic accountability over development and how funding and economic security systems are used and evolve. And I suggest that there is a relationship between these two, that between risk pooling and governance coordination, meaning that both are likely to be higher or lower in the same society. And there's a dynamic relationship as well in terms of up or downscaling effects over time. And neoliberalism tends to engineer downscaling effects. This, of course, depends on different factors again, such as whether neoliberalism was homegrown and the degree of past developmental capability. So, for example, in South Korea, neoliberalism was broadly imposed from the outside in a context of high capability. Creeping neoliberalism with the attempt to accede to the OECD, with financial liberalization, which was a contributing factor to the 1997 crisis, and then after the 1997 crisis, IMF bailouts and conditions that came with that. But the existence, the prior existence of developmental capability is important, I think, to understand how, despite IMF intervention, Korea defied neoliberalism in some very important ways by converting its developmental capabilities after 1997 and retaining some of the old ones. And one of the examples of conversion is remarkable, nearly 30%, actually 50% over a longer period rise of the level of taxation in GDP in a span of about 15 years. And also, in the same period, the rise of over 300% of spending on social protection, specifically income transfers of different types in Korea, which I think is unprecedented in a neoliberal era. Although from a low level, nevertheless, if you compare with the Nordic states, for example, which sat with Britain at the end of the 1960s and then expanded their tax base quite radically during the 1970s and retained a different status from Britain after that, even if there was some lowering of taxes, income taxes, especially in Sweden. Nevertheless, these countries stayed ahead, as it were. I think Korea's transformation in the neoliberal era is comparably more remarkable. And I think some of these new mechanisms are key factors in Korea's remarkable COVID performance, alongside with governance capabilities linked with the democratization process, including the experiments that have taken place at lower levels of government. On the other hand, I think the problem with especially homegrown neoliberalism is that as it evolves, it cuts off its own legs. It not only disempowers lower levels of government, which we've seen, the level of funding in the UK, for example, has been halved during the period of neoliberalism, but also neoliberal economies generate a weaker tax base and yet require ever greater government subsidy of the real economy, not just jobs, but also privatized services. And this drives a downscaling effect between capability and pooling in neoliberal states, which makes neoliberalism self-destructive. And I think this played out under COVID. So neoliberal countries tended to pursue what I call the sugar rush approach. They delayed action because their capability was lower and their exposure was greater, which then generated paralysis, as in Britain. By the time lockdown was imposed, society was in crisis. So the need for rushing in longer lockdowns, higher spending, followed by greater recession, generating greater fiscal deficits and restraints in the long run. Governance capability tends instead to promote the turtle approach, early, thoughtful action that entailed less wasted energy, meaning either less spend, as in Denmark, or Korea also comparably spent less in terms of foregone fiscal revenue and direct fiscal revenue, or more effective spend, as in both Korea and Denmark. And Denmark's lockdown, of course, was announced many weeks before Britain's and had a clear tripartite government economic framework in place before it began. Schools were closed for a matter of weeks compared with Britain's nearly 6 months. Here I'm talking about the first wave of COVID. While in Britain, GDP fell by 22.1% in the second quarter of 2020. In the same quarter, Danish and Korean GDP fell by 6.8% and 3.2%, with the US at 9% in between there. Employment recovery in different countries also followed a similar pattern. In South Korea, it was timed at around the third quarter of 2021, Denmark about a year later, and Britain's and the US has been estimated at the fourth quarter of 2023, so we're not even there yet. And I could go on with general economic performance data, but you get the gist, I think. So this takes us to the next point, which concerns the way that the impact of these outcomes were mediated within economic security systems. And we need here to keep in mind two groups of people, the quarter or one-third of the labor market that is more vulnerable in every country. How much more vulnerable, of course, is important, but nevertheless, you find this sort of stratification in every country, and how other groups' cost of living is supported in a crisis as well. Britain was, in these terms, a case of high but relative ineffective spending if you consider the needs of these groups. The UK and the US direct fiscal spend in GDP was about 20 and 25%, respectively, in 2020, while it was just over 3% in Denmark, around 5% or less in other Nordic states, and around 7% in Korea. This is just foregone fiscal revenue, direct fiscal revenue, not loan guarantees and some other outlays of that nature. And partly this differential spend, this immediate fiscal pressure, was driven by the effect of delays, of course, but other factors in terms of how it impacted on people. The design of income security systems was very important. So in the UK, there was a 29% rise in claims to the universal credit, the flat income assistance system that the UK has in a 5-week period between April and May of 2020, the very important period, which may look like a success in terms of the ability of the system to incorporate people quite quickly, but really it wasn't, given the puny coverage and the means test as well. The puny coverage in terms of 40% of an average wage, which is one of the worst levels of coverage in the OECD in terms of average coverage of income security systems. Now, if you take all transfers, including housing benefits and so on, the UK fares rather well. But if you take just the cash component, that's a different story. And of course, Britain has no unemployment insurance system. So the cost of furlough, which is the equivalent to unemployment insurance effectively, is felt entirely on the British government, on the fiscal system, while people with assets who lost their jobs or hours who weren't on furlough were not necessarily covered by any income scheme. So no wonder the government was scared of imposing lockdown because of the lack of preparedness and the risks to people that this would entail. And I'd argue that both of these groups that I identified before, they suffered comparatively within the UK's neoliberal model relative to these other countries I'm looking at. So in Denmark, where unemployment insurance covers about 2/3 of the unemployed normally, the number of people receiving public economic assistance of some kind rose by about 6.5% and fell again by 3.3% the following year, so 6.5 in 2020 and then falling the next year. And I think the existence of this prior risk pooling mechanisms that the government could rely on, draw on, was an important factor. And also, this is the case in Korea. Before the pandemic, Korea had achieved a rate of coverage of its EI system of 96% among regular employees. Of course, this is a privileged group, and a much lower rate, nearly 63% among irregular employees. And this is an unfortunate differential that is a historic differential that reflects a historic differential between categories of workers in South Korea. And this, of course, is unacceptable. But nevertheless, and this is important, coverage for both groups was very high compared with other countries in a system only implemented in 1995. And I think this is important. And I think also in South Korea, there's evidence of an upscaling effect between systems, with assistance being too low in South Korea, of course, but nevertheless, I think other new approaches that were tried out during COVID is going to mean that there might be an impetus for change across economic security systems. As I'm going to discuss, South Korea began implementing economic support measures already in January 2020, 2 months before countries in Europe, and over the next 3 months, the government decreed 3 successive significant increases in economic support. First, to incentivize take-up of the employment insurance system, with employee compensation rising for other workers unemployed. The other side of 2/3 to 3/3 to 9/10 of wage cost over these 3 months. While in December 2020, coverage was extended to subcontractor workers, which is a move that has to some extent been maintained, or an impetus that has been maintained, as I'll discuss in a moment. And the system was able to move existing funds for training, these are earmarked funds that were already there, part of the shared security system, over to employment retention, which went from 12.8% of spending within the system to 27% in 2020. And much of that was then able to be pulled from the shared savings that existed. But not only this, I think South Korea's overall economic support package was diversified and it was quite generous by international standards. The government spent on SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, nearly 3 times of the subsidies that it gave to the unemployment insurance system. Of course, it was partly able to do that because of the existence of the unemployment insurance system. The SME sector employed many of the precarious workers. And in March 2020, the government extended a childcare leave scheme or benefit to single parents who could, so that they did not have to work when school or daycare centres were closed. Nothing like this existed, of course, in the UK, where many people work from home at the same time as trying to educate their children. South Korea expanded the level of job seekers benefit from 50% of the average wage to 60%, which compares very favorably even with the British rate, as I already mentioned. Now, in Denmark, the ceiling for UI payments is about 3/4 of average earnings, but of course it's higher for lower earners, approximately 90% of the previous wage, which is an important part of the solidaristic composition of that system, the fact that it has some government subsidy and the way that it's structured to compensate those at the lower end of the wage scale, which is really important when you compare them with privatized UI systems or individual accounts UI systems, like in neoliberal Chile, for example, which is inadequate for low-wage workers and doesn't really work. Now, assistance, as I mentioned, in South Korea is too low. It's 30% of the median income, which is not enough. But if we take, again, only cash and not housing subsidies, it's still larger, significantly larger than the UK's in pure cash terms. And I think, given that it's a system only started in 1995, and there's now a debate about extending coverage to low-income workers or irregular workers in South Korea, there's scope for raising that benefit and for arguing for that in combination with arguing for a basic income floor in the form of a basic income. The important point here, though, when we think in systemic terms, is that unemployment insurance benefits are not asset tested or means tested, while assistance is. So in neoliberal states with these flat systems that have asset or mean tests, more groups, typically, of course, benefits being very low, as I just mentioned, all groups suffer under that sort of system. So what I'm saying here is that neoliberalism really cut government capacity and coverage of needs in Britain by flattening its welfare state. And this needs to be borne in mind when you think about, well, what's going to succeed universal credit? Is it going to be a purely flat system, or is it going to be a system that offers other opportunities for savings as well and wider coverage? So the benefit, I think, potentially of combining a basic income with some form of employment and unemployment insurance in Korea, which already has this system, is that none of these systems would be asset or means tested, which is very important for developmental justice, the ability for people to control their economic circumstances in a dynamic sense. And there are also lessons, I think, from South Korea in terms of its process of democratizations, from the way in which lessons or experiments done at the municipal or regional level were upscaled during the COVID crisis. And I'm thinking of course, Korea's basic income scheme for youth and farmers from Gyeonggi province, and the inspiration that gave to new systems during COVID. Specifically, South Korea was one of the first countries to implement a quasi-basic income emergency policy, as we all know, by distributing food vouchers to be consumed locally to the whole population. Began in May 2020, and I've heard that the Gyeonggi province scheme was very significant inspiration and evidence base for that approach. So while not a basic income, I mean, the latter measure was nonetheless equal, it was universal, it was essentially non-conditional. Of course, it was in the form of a food voucher, so if you're a stickler, it's not unconditional, but that was justified, I think, on good grounds during the crisis, because it also helped support local businesses and farmers as well. So this one-time universal transfer made up almost 20% of additional spend, and it served to sustain, as I said, consumption and local restaurants and shops serving local or selling local produce. It was originally going to be rich tested with the top 30% on the income scale, as I understand it, but it was made universal. Low-income households received the grant automatically, while others had to apply, unfortunate from the perspective of basic income. Or they could donate their share, which 2% did, to the unemployment, or the employment rather, insurance system, which I think is an interesting crossover there. And very importantly, the government was able to make the transfers to 96% of households within 1 month. So the pilots that have been going on in South Korea inspired this, and then this experience will provide, again, evidence and I think a basis for further campaigns for non-means tested income security in South Korea. After COVID, so we've seen already, there's been experiments now with several food voucher pilots. Again, it's not cash grant scheme, but these run alongside, as I understand it, income assistance. They're not a replacement for cash grants. So you see like a diversification of instruments of economic security that are considering livelihoods as well as income needs. It's not like US food vouchers, because that can be spent on more widely, but they target healthy and nationally produced food. Some people say this is conditional, but I think it's also part of the green transition that we're all hoping for, and I think therefore very important. But also innovations have occurred in the Ewha system as well, which shows that this sort of trade-off between innovations in one part or one type of income assistance system is a trade-off to other innovations. That is not the case in real terms, in real political terms, it's not the case. The Korean government with social partners sat down very early on and set down a roadmap for coverage of the employment insurance system of all workers in South Korea by 2025, starting with artists, December 2020, during COVID, of course, and then moving to dependent contractors, July 2021, platform workers, January 2022, other workers, July 2022, and self-employed workers by 2025. And the idea is to use social dialogue to devise the conditions. And of course, these things are subject to political capture and reversals, but I think nonetheless, we've seen a proliferation of innovations during COVID in South Korea. So I want to conclude on 3 points then. First, I think that the COVID crisis has shown the upscaling effects that exist within developmental governance systems between different forms of economic protection and innovation, and that they are important for developmental justice outcomes. Not perfect outcomes, but moving in the direction of developmental justice. I think basic income supporters should embrace the notion of a basic income floor as part of this form of developmental governance and innovation. And second, they listen to Korea's own traditions rather than what global organizations are saying, because to my mind, they're advocating downscaling, not upscaling of economic security systems. And this, of course, has been going on for a long time. And so the OECD, for example, before the pandemic, recommended for South Korea to get rid of employment protections and flatten its income security system to create fairness and productivity. It's a standard neoliberal line, quote, breaking down dualism requires reducing employment protection for regular workers. And this is being argued everywhere. But deregulating and flattening will do neither of those things. It will not create fairness, or it will dumb down fairness at best. And it will not increase productivity. And we would just have to look at Korea's high growth period, and innovation has come about in a very composite and complex economic security system, not a flat one. And we've seen where a flat one tends in Britain, the punitive meager benefits that no one can actually live on, and with workloads for everyone that are off the chart, no one has control over the process. So on the one hand, as the OECD rightly notes, the fact that a lower share, that's 73% according to their figures, of irregular workers, but at that time was covered by employment insurance in Korea, is problematic, given that the workers are in precarious jobs. But the OECD is actually arguing for expanding precariousness to more workers, is not arguing for upscaling or bringing in workers within a more protected regime for all. So I think there are important lessons there, that we should not accept a basic income as a source of passively encasing and accepting contemporary neoliberal trends to isolated online working or casualization in general. Neoliberalism and casualization are not an opportunity for basic income. They are a problem for basic income. So we should not rush to be accepted or agree with every global agency, but we should critically scrutinize their case or argument for basic income, which increasingly aligns with this proposal for flattening the economic security system, because it's not in our interest to be part of the problem of neoliberalism by essentially propping it up around the edges and accept lowering standards as the route to equality. So I'd say any country that has developmental capability and risk pooling systems in place, don't let any agency, global agency, tell you to simply flatten them. That's the devil's deal. It's a rush to a low-level equality that lacks substance. And I don't think that's what basic income ought to be about. But more importantly, I don't think it's what it is about, because the real evidence shows us that countries with developmental capability and risk pooling systems are more likely to innovate in the direction of more secure rights, of upscaling. It is in that space, I think, that basic income ought to be argued for, not outside that space. And I think we can, and we need to pick up those lessons from COVID. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Oh, I forgot to mention, thank you. I forgot to mention that we actually have two topics for this session, that she's not talking about the definition of basic income. So now on to the definition. Our next speaker is one of the founding members of BN and the chair of the first BN meeting, and the meeting where the name BN was coined back in 1986, and who has been a nonstop member of the UBI movement and of BN in all these years, a prolific author who most authors, as their career goes on, they begin to slow down, and our next author just seems to write more and more, getting more prolific every year that her career goes on. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you. Does she need an introduction? I don't think so. Annie Miller.
Thank you, Karl. Recently, I described myself as being in mid-career. This was set up and then it turned itself off again. Right. So we think that basic income is simple, don't we? Ha ha. 40 years later, I'm still struggling. I want to acknowledge that I've had the benefit of discussions with my fellow colleagues in the clarification of the basic income definition for the last 4 years. This group was appointed at GA 4 years ago. And I want to acknowledge useful discussions, very helpful, with Toru Yamamori, Telemak Mesol, and Ali Mutlu Korlioglu, who isn't here. Anyway, the whole point is that how do we define this? It's a very simple concept, but very difficult to define. Now, the context is that the modern welfare state comprises a cash-based social security system and social services, social welfare services, usually in kind, but not necessarily, including things like housing, health, and education. The social security itself is divided into social insurance and social assistance. And a lot of countries don't have the social assistance, just the social insurance, or the social assistance is so minor, it's hardly recognizable. And it usually consists of some income-tested benefits. And where there are non-income-tested benefits, that's where the basic income would be located. Can't get it to. Oh, whoops, gone too far now. The pre-2016 definition stated, a basic income is an income unconditionally granted to all on an individual basis without means test or work requirement. However, in the GA of 2016, after an extensive discussion during the Congress, a new definition was agreed on, which says a basic income is a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without means test or work requirement. And you'll see that there are very few words that have actually been changed, the words in red. And, whoops, go back again. The definition, the definitive statement is followed by this. That is, a basic income has the following 5 characteristics, and the bits in red are the new bits. First of all, it's periodic. It is paid at regular intervals, for example, every month, not as a one-off grant. It's a cash payment. It's paid in an appropriate medium of exchange, allowing those who receive it to decide what they spend it on. It is not therefore paid either in kind, such as food or services, or in vouchers dedicated to a specific use, and the rest of it remains the same. Now, one of my queries is, why was the definition changed from granted to delivered? Because unconditionally delivered implies that only the delivery was unconditional. Similarly, delivered to all on an individual basis could imply that only the delivery was an individual basis. The order of words in English is very important, and certainly delivered is not the same as granted. So I would like to suggest an edit for clarification to reinstate the granted, so that the definitive statement comes back to a periodic cash payment unconditionally granted to all, and then with the rest. And that restores the action that it's actually the payment, the granting of the payment that's unconditional. I'm going to look at the characteristics in turn to see whether I think they could be improved. And the first 2, which were the most recently added, I think is okay. They may not be, but there's nothing obvious that sprang out to me. But if anyone's got concerns about them, please let me know later. Now, individual, it says it's paid on an individual basis and not, for instance, to households. Now, that's crazy. It makes it sound as though if you're in a household as opposed to being on your own, you don't get it. I mean, it's just not clear. And so also we should bring in the concept of the couple, because a couple and a household are not the same. You can have a couple within a household and they're different benefit units. So I would suggest an edit for clarification, which says individual, it is paid on an individual basis and not, for instance, on the basis of a couple or household. And that, I think, clarifies it. It's not making a major difference to it, but it's just clarifying the English, and I think it's quite important. 4, universal. It's paid to all without means test. Now, in the past, some people have interpreted universal as to mean uniform. In other words, it's not just it goes to everyone, but everyone gets the same amount. But universal indicates only who is eligible. It's not a matter of what the level is. And other people ask whether everyone includes children. I mean, as though children are not people. And in some countries, they have very low status, so they might not be included as adults, as everyone. And we can note that the children's basic incomes will be administered on their behalf by the main caregiving parent or guardian. But how much needs to be changed? Well, my suggestion, editing for clarification, is to include the universal indicates who is eligible. It is paid to all, including children, without means test. Now, the excellent exposition by Professor Seoul on day 1, she reinterpreted the ex-ante characteristic. Someone said, what does ex-ante mean? And she thought it meant unconditional. But I'm reminded that initially it was stated that eligibility is not based on existing categories or circumstances, obviously which include financial circumstances. And this is a way of saying that the benefit is not dependent on financial circumstances. It's without a means test. And so I would like to suggest that we change for universal to say indicates who is eligible. It is paid to all, including children, without means test. That is, eligibility is not based on existing categories or circumstances. Now, where we have circumstances which are existing, we call these ex ante conditions, and later we'll be talking about ex post conditions. So these are existing conditions, and it's these that eligibility doesn't vary by, and that's what the without means test refers to. And then we go on to unconditional, and it states it is paid without a requirement to work or to demonstrate willingness to work. Now, I looked at this and thought, well, this is unconditional. That's pretty clear. But hey, where's this no work condition come into? Why have we suddenly limited it to this? Or does it? I mean, it's not very clear. There's a bit of a contradiction here. And we know that the work requirement is a very male preoccupation. And does it really mean work for pay? Or are we saying there should be no requirement to do unpaid work? It's not clear at all. And we know that non-conditionality is an ex-post characteristic about not imposing new conditions. And there are many other types of behavioural requirements that could be imposed. Women could be required to have a certain dress code. There could be all sorts of requirements that could be imposed that the clerks who dream up these conditions can think of. So what I would like to suggest instead is that unconditional becomes it is paid without any behavioural requirements, for instance, to work for pay or to demonstrate willingness to work for pay, to undertake volunteer work or to behave according to traditional gender roles. In other words, it's obligation-free. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, and I'm sure it can be shortened, and I will give a shortened version at the end. And this change will require a change to the definitive statement, whereas my previous ones didn't require that. Now, that's a fairly minor and important change, but a minor one compared with my next proposal, which is about introducing a new characteristic called uniform. Some people said, why not have equal? The term equal and this concept of equality comes with a whole lot of baggage, and I thought uniform was a bit more simple. Now, first of all, universal does not indicate anything about the level of basic income. We're just talking about whether some people get more and some people less. We know that there are different types of prejudice exist around the world based on misogyny, homophobia, race and creed, among other things. Humans, sadly, have this propensity towards prejudice. And the Biang organization would have to endorse any program which met the current BI definition as a genuine BI program, even if it were prejudicial. In other words, you could find that there are schemes which give more to men than to women, or heaven forbid, more to women than to men. That would be a surprise. And it could be that such a scheme would be proposed, and Biang would have to say, yes, this fits our criteria. And it's the characteristics which define basic income. So having an individual basis would not prevent discrimination. The individual basis, which is characteristic number 3, doesn't stop discrimination against cohabiting partners. It stops the poorer partner being financially abused or coerced. But it doesn't stop a jurisdiction imposing discrimination against cohabiting partners. And this happens quite a lot, certainly in the UK, that if you're a cohabiting couple, man or wife, or non-married cohabiting partners, then they get less in benefits because it's assumed that they don't need them because of household economies of scale. So it would prevent this sort of discrimination, which stops the cohabiting couples from enjoying household economies of scale, which are already being enjoyed by 2 non-cohabiting individuals sharing accommodation, such as students sharing a flat, for instance. If we wanted to take into account household economies of scale, imagine what we'd have to do for dormitories or hotels or places like that if we were going to go to the logical extreme, which isn't always very wise. Anyway, this is one of the reasons for having uniform in. Oops, overdoing it now. Here we are. Nope. Playing tricks on me. So a new characteristic uniform. No, I've done that already, sorry. Uniform continued. Now, basic income's characteristics are all about freedom from oppression and discrimination. So if we think that uniform could reduce the threat of discrimination, then we should adopt it sooner rather than later, without waiting for jurisdictions to violate it before deciding to do something about it. It's good to think about it in advance. And also, discrimination is more likely to be introduced in the social assistance program than in social insurance. Social insurance has more of the nature of a legal contract, whereas social assistance is just the rich man's concession to the despised poor. The legislative details and major reforms are often introduced by civil servants who could subconsciously be tacit opponents of basic income. So this is too important just to be left to a detail. We need to acknowledge it now and introduce it at this stage. But I'd also suggest that having to make the case for differentiation should help to prevent casual prejudice being built in. You know, there's nothing to stop jurisdictions saying we're going to have discrimination, but if they have to make a case for it and in order to still have the being recognized as a basic income, then it should help to stop casual prejudice. Now, when we say that a basic income would be uniform, it's not assumed that it would be identical worldwide or frozen over time. Uniformity would apply to a given jurisdiction at a given time, but the basic income payments could be indexed over time. So it's just to do within the jurisdiction. But one of the contraindications might a generous uniform basic income, where children and adults get the same, might this encourage larger families? Is this something that is of a concern? Maybe not in Korea, for instance, where there's a fertility problem. Oops, I've gone too far again. So, uniform rejects variations based on ex ante, that is, existing categories or circumstances, and whereas unconditionality is based on ex post differentiation. And so uniform has got close associations with both universal and unconditional, and I would suggest it should be positioned between them as the new characteristic number 5. So my suggested edit would be uniform. The amount of a basic income is the same or equal for everyone within a given jurisdiction at a given time and does not vary according to pre-existing categories or circumstances. Now, this suggested change would require a change to the definitive statement. And it's a much more serious, much more profound one than just changing work requirement to behavioral requirement. But the definitive statement would become a basic income is a periodic uniform cash payment unconditionally granted to all on an individual basis without means test or behavioral requirement. Now, there's still going to be some situations where you need a case for having differentiated benefits. And the obvious case is for tax-exempt, individual-based, unconditional cash disability benefits to be paid in addition to the basic incomes. Some people said, what about regional price variations, including housing costs? But these, where you do make concessions to this merely exacerbates the situation, so that if you start giving extra benefits to London compared with rural Highlands and Scotland, it just increases the costs in London and reduces them in the Highlands of Scotland, so it exacerbates the situation. So it might be better to deal with policies like that to reduce those inequalities via taxation. You need a different instrument. However, a separate system for meeting widely varying housing costs, as is happening in so many countries around the world, may have to be retained or devised in the meantime, and there could be quite a lot of debate about that. Sometimes a case for differentiation could be met more effectively via public welfare services, and we note that these are not substitutes for cash benefits, but the cash benefits and the welfare services are complementary. Now, sometimes people have put forward a case to differentiate the cash benefits to achieve an adequate standard of living. So the level of cash benefits that we needed for an adequate standard of living will depend on circumstances, including the jurisdiction's provision of welfare services in kind, for instance. There are three main methods for estimating adequacy levels: using focus groups, statistical analysis, and using something like the OECD poverty benchmark. And each of them acknowledges that adequacy varies with age, with adults requiring greater cash benefits than children. So this could be met by delivering individual-based, age-related, unconditional adequacy top-up cash payments in addition to the basic income payments, without actually having to include it as part of the basic income. Now, this is a bit of an artifice, but it does help to keep the underlying situation clear. You've got a uniform basic income, and then you might have extra cash supplements. And it's important to notice that a basic income will not replace all other cash benefits. And these could include, first of all, the basic income payments, which are so fundamental, the baseline for the cash benefits. You could have adequacy top-up payments, other differentiation benefits, for instance, for disability. There could be some retained means-tested benefits, especially in situations where your basic income is less than the current means-tested benefits, and so only part or whole of the basic income is taken into account when estimating the entitlement to the means-tested benefits. And you could have retained social insurance benefits as well. And then you can have benefits for which basic income is not a good substitute. For instance, a welfare fund for emergencies, providing payments to cover emergencies such as fire or flood. And notice that the different cash benefits don't have to be delivered separately. They can be aggregated if their frequencies and the benefit units are coincidental. We can't assume that they're going to be, but if they have got the same frequencies and the same benefit units, then they can be aggregated. But the different component types, whether it's basic income, adequacy, top-up payment, disability, etc., should always be clear. And this is important for transparency. I don't trust the authorities. I want to make sure they're not diddling me or other people. So if we've got the different components are identified, then we've got more idea of transparency and therefore accountability. So the big question is, should basic income's definition include an adequacy threshold? But I want to emphasize again, a basic income program is an instrument that leads to anticipated outcomes. A basic income program is not a policy objective and should be independent of policy objectives. An adequacy threshold would convert a basic income into a policy objective, which would conflate the two concepts and cause confusion. A basic income is a transformative foundational instrument which could be part of a strategy to eliminate material poverty and enable the social and cultural participation of every individual. And that is, or used to be, on the BIAN website. We could say it in a different way. We could say that a basic income could still be a significant part of achieving an adequate standard of living for all. You can achieve that policy objective without having to create a threshold within the definition in order to achieve it. So should a definition of a basic income include an adequacy threshold? I would say no, but there's a lot of contention about this, and you're entitled to disagree with me, of course, but I would still state my case. And it's been suggested that a basic income is a human right. And yes, a basic income should be a human right, but it's not one yet, nor does including it in the definition make it so. It's a legal matter in the gift of the United Nations. A decision would be based on basic income's anticipated simultaneous beneficial outcomes, not on its definition. Similarly, other legal safeguards, such as non-foreclosure and inalienability, which is the debt protection procedures, are legal matters not determined by the definition of basic income. So the suggested revised definition would include the red parts. The definitive statement would become a basic income is a periodic uniform cash payment unconditionally granted to all on an individual basis without means test or behavioral requirement. That is, a basic income has the following 6 characteristics. Now, the periodic and the cash payment remain the same, so I'll just go on to 3, individual. It is paid on an individual basis and not, for instance, on the basis of a couple or household. Universal indicates who is eligible. It is paid to all, including children, without means test. And now there's the possibility of adding, that is, eligibility is does not vary according pre-existing categories or circumstances. The new proposed characteristic is uniform. The amount of a basic income is the same or equal for everyone within a given jurisdiction at a given time and does not vary according to pre-existing categories or circumstances. And finally, unconditionally becomes number 6. And this is the short version, but we can go back to the longer version, which I put forward before if it's thought necessary. But we could just state it's paid without any behavioral requirement. It is obligation free. And that's the end. Thank you very much.
Don't trip. Dangerous. All right. Thank you, Annie. Now, I can respond to 2 of the things that Annie said with that asked for clarification. One thing I think is really important for all of us to understand is to change these things, what would need a vote of the General Assembly and what does not. As I remember, you can check the minutes of the 2016 meeting, but what I remember us doing at the 2016 meeting is deciding that only that short definition needs a vote of the General Assembly. That very short definition, a short 1 or 2 sentence definition that can be discussed in a large group like this, that was voted on by the General Assembly. Then they turned over to the EC to ask someone to draft the elaboration. So that long elaboration of what that 1 sentence definition means, that is the purview of the EC. So some of the things that you suggested about that elaboration doesn't need to go through a General Assembly meeting. That the clarification of household, the part about the household, those clarifications about some of those clarifications, the EC could ask someone to make those changes, to make some of those changes right now. They don't have to be approved by the General Assembly. They could do that anytime they want. Now, the other one, whether this is the right or the wrong decision, I can tell you why granted. So really what Louise here has then made 3 little proposals to change 3 words in the definition. Now, one of those, I can tell you why we did it in 2016, why we changed granted to delivered, is because a king grants you a knighthood. A postal worker delivers your security, your Social Security check. We wanted to get away from anything that connotated a gift, that this was something that might be construed as a gift to you, that you are given this, that it is not a gift, but is something that should be made into a right of citizenship. So we choose delivered for those connotations. Right or wrong, that was the reasoning. Okay, so with those clarifications, we have our 3rd speaker who is talking about the definition. Our 3rd speaker should be queued up on a pre-recorded talk. Our 3rd speaker should be queued up for the pre-recorded talk, and that is I think one of the longest serving members of the EC of all time, who's also a prolific author and one of the few people in this organization who's actually written a best-selling book about basic income, a bestseller in Japan. He's big in Japan. but that's okay. He's from Japan. And his name is Toru Yamamori. Okay, we have the tape of Toru.
Hello, 안녕하세요, everyone. First of all, 감사합니다. Thank you very much for organizing this wonderful congress and for inviting me for this plenary session. It's a really honor to be invited.
Are you live? Live?
Hello, 안녕하세요, everyone. First of all, 감사합니다. Thank you very much for organizing this wonderful congress and for inviting me for this plenary session. It's a really honor to be invited together with Annie Miller, wonderful founder of Bian, and also honored to be chaired by Karl Widerquist. Deep apologies that I could not be in Seoul in person. I miss you, Annie, Karl, Hyo-sang, and our Korean friend. Today, I am talking on the history of the discussion on the definition of basic income. But unlike Annie's powerful presentation, it is not my aim to argue either for or against the current Bian definition. Rather, I want to situate this definition historiographically, enabling fruitful discussion. My presentation is partially based on my paper published in the last year, showing the slide, but also has some new arguments that weren't in the paper. I have had 2 occasions of privilege to collectively learn from our friend. One was actually in Seoul when the Bien's Congress happened in the first occasion in East Asia. It was 2016, where the working group for the definition of basic income was set, and I was appointed to the chair. The second occasion was the Bien General Assembly in Hyderabad, 2019. General Assembly determined to have a working group for the clarification of basic income definition and appointed Annie and myself as co-chairs. I have learned a lot in these occasions, and the latter occasion is still continuing. But the view shown in this presentation does not represent neither of the working group, and it is entirely my personal view. So, does a penny per month constitute a basic income? Was that penny to be paid individually, universally, and unconditionally? The answer is yes, following the definition of basic income given by our Bian or by Philippe Van Pares and Yannick Vanderbolt's book in 2017. However, the answer would be no if we were to follow either definitions adopted by more than 10 regional affiliates of Bian or definitions by some leading advocates such as Guy Standing in his several books, or Karl Widerquist, or Philip himself again, but in his paper in 1989. So the further difference between those two is whether there is some notion of threshold level to be taken as minimum or as adequate. Notion of threshold is multifariously worded, like as I show in this slide, like covering basic need or constitute minimum, etc. What is common among the latter in the previous slide, like Guy and Karl and our 10 regional affiliates, all of them presuppose a certain minimum threshold as essential component of basic income. Here I use the term threshold as shorthand for minimum threshold. I do not mean to suggest the maximum threshold. I used to use this image to explain what is basic income and what is not. And obviously, as you all might agree, among those 4, this is below right. This one is basic income. But recently, some in Bian criticized to have a basic income with this kind of threshold? Yes, that question is right in terms of a BN definition. So maybe we need to take BN definition seriously. Then we need another picture, another image. That is this one. So this one is more accurate. Those images cannot be accurate in any sense, but intuitively we can grasp with those kind of image, and this one is much more properly corresponding to our BN definition. So now let me concentrate on the contrast of these two. Yes. So that this is one with a threshold, basic income with a threshold, right? And this line is a threshold level. But now, BN's definition doesn't have this kind of threshold. So it can be either 1 penny or 1 won, or whatever, or one real, or whatever currency it is. It can be really small. And so it can be captured like this. And in my paper, I call it like basic income without threshold, but it's very difficult to pronounce, so, and also not intuitive. So now I suggest to call it basic income as negative poll tax. Poll tax is a tax. Everyone have to pay same amount of tax. But by definition, in the definition, there are no level amount of the burden tax is referred. So this BN definition of basic income is exactly same as or nothing more than what we could call negative poll tax. So the yes, in order to avoid with without it's a bit confusing. So that this one is basic income with a threshold. This one basic income as negative poll tax. I would differentiate to code in this way through the rest of my presentation. So now, why do we have those two different definitions of basic income? How are we in this parallel world? In order to understand why we are in this parallel world, we need to locate our current situation in the history. So please let me give you an overview of history of the term basic income. As far as I was able to trace back to on the usage of the term basic income in a sense that related to our current use, either with threshold or as negative poll tax model, it can be traced back to 1919. Dennis Miller, who was advocate of state bonus, referred his idea as basic minimum income. But inserting the term like minimum between the basic and income, some might argue it's not the exact use of the term basic income. Then we can have another year, well, it's 1932, and 1932, 3, 4, Hobart, Paulus, Van Tirvans, Serulsken, advocate basis in common, and also around the same time, Jan T. Bergen, later he got Nobel Prize of Economics, advocated basis in common. And well, again, why you suddenly mentioned the Dutch language is we should stick in English. And then I could offer another year, it's 1939. Everybody knows the economist John Maynard Keynes. He got a letter from George Vanderbilt, and in that letter, George Vanderbilt explained the basic income to John Maynard Keynes. And it's a private letter, and some of you are not happy. I mentioned those guys things which should be in a publication, everybody can see it. And then 1953, George D.H. Cole, who had been advocating social dividend, somehow his proposal social dividend, many people put it in the history of basic income, but his proposal itself is conditional. But he referred to John Stuart Mill's remark on some Fourier's idea in mid-19th century, and it was unconditional. Well, we are not sure it's really individual basis or not, but yes, when he referred to John Stuart Mill, he used the term basic income. And all of these were, you can decide which is the proper beginning of our basic income, but all of them come with some threshold, concept threshold. All of them don't think a penny amount of basic income. So we would say safely in the beginning with a threshold. So then in 1960s, 70s, there are vague concepts of basic income or guaranteed income and minimum income circulated, and they were interchangeably used. All came with a threshold. And let me give you one concrete example. In the UK, the Women Claimant Union articulated what initially they called the guaranteed adequate income. And it was around 1972, but 1977, they succeeded to make what they called guaranteed minimum income at the time as an official demand of the British women's liberation movement. And how they defined as that guaranteed minimum income, is it unconditional, it's individual, it's universal, and it came with a threshold. And then 1980s is a very special decade, because what makes different this decade from the before I explained is, in the case of Jan Tinbergen, G.D.H. Cole, they advocated something that we call basic income, but it's kind of individual endeavor. And there are some criticism and correspondence that exists, but it's not really proper collective discussion on it. And in the case of Claimant Union, yes, they have an intense internal discussion among claimant, people who gathered in the Claimant Union, but it's not academic. By the 1980s, we started to have collective but academically rigorous discussion. And the first occasion I would take is Basic Income Research Group, a British organization. Now it still exists under a different name. It's called Citizens Basic Income Trust, UK. And this was founded in 1984. And in the first occasion, at least 1988, they officially defined basic income as to guarantee to each man, woman, and child the unconditional right to an independent income sufficient to meet basic living costs. Or there are several other wordings, but all of definition by them come with a threshold. And well, please delete official from this slide. Maybe Walter Van Trier, my admirable friend, was not happy with to call this letter as official. But Philip Van Parijs organized two very, very important international conferences in 1980s. One is 1986, the other is 1989. And the 1986 one, people gathered in this conference decided to launch basic income European network. And so as a secretary of the conference, Philip sent a letter to the participant and who are interested in basic income but not coming to the conference. And in that letter, yes, Philip announced and launched a foundation basic income European network, and there he describes basic income with this threshold. I thought this is the official letter from the Congress because it's under the name of the secretary of the conference, but it might be misunderstandable like official letter beyond, which I don't mean, so that please delete this official. And thank you for reminding me this, Volta. Well, Volta, I'm not sure he is here or not. And the latter conference, Philip organized in 1989, Philip gave kind of opening presentation, and there he distinguished two concepts. One is called basic income, the other is called universal grant. And universal grant is something similar to negative poll tax, as we know now, BM definition of the basic income. But basic income, what he called at the time in 1989, that is sufficient to cover a person's basic need. So it comes with threshold. Yes, the definition is threshold continue because that conference, 1989 conference, the result of which became a book called Arguing for Basic Income, edited by Philip Van Parijs. And there, Philip Van Parijs in that book changed his definition, but many contributors follow the Philip's definition in 1989, that is come with threshold. I can just give you a few examples, like all our famous philosophers. John Baker is still, is he here? I don't know if he's here. Say hello, John. But all of them define basic income with threshold, and this continue to this day. As I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, Guy Standing cited from his book in 2011, but in many other books, his definition of basic income comes with some kind of threshold. And Karl Widerquist, Karl, hi, hello. Yes, Karl's book, it's one of my favorite books, Basic Income, which published in 2013. And here again, he defined basic income with threshold. And also many our regional affiliates. This is a case of unconditional basic income Europe. It says what is basic income and it's high enough. This is a case of basic income Ireland, sufficient to live a frugal but decent life without additional income. And this is a case of basic income Canada network. So now, how negative poll tax type of definition is invented in this history? It was in the late 1980s. Vienna, 1986 gathering was not, well, now we call it the first Congress, but people gathered without knowing it would be called the first Congress of Vienna in the history. But people gathered as they known as a Vienna Congress. The first one is actually 1988, where it is recorded as second. And that second conference in General Assembly, they agreed to have a definition, and it was negative poll tax type of definition. And we have occasion to discuss and change a bit definition in 2016. It's quite funny. There are two motions. One of them has a threshold. One of them is two options. One has a threshold, and we kind of agreed to have a threshold in our definition, but somehow we could not reach the consensus on what's the wording of it. Then in the end, the definition left out without any threshold. So since 1988, when Vienna had official definition basic income, until today, the Vienna's definition of basic income comes without threshold. So it's a negative poll tax model. And citizen income trust, I mentioned, it's changed, definition of basic income in 1988. And Philip, yes, as I shown here and also the previous slide in 1989, he defined basic income as sufficient to cover a person's basic need, and also says that is one connotation of the basic income as it is standard to be understood. But 3 years later, when he published the book, came out of that conference, his position totally changed. As I expressed on basic income, not, however, meant to suggest link with so-called basic need. Yes, the reason that changed at the BRG, CBIT it's interesting, in the 1988 spring newsletter informed they had a panel to discuss, internal panel in the group to discuss officially what basic income should be defined. And Bill Jordan put a report as a capacity of represented that panel. And their basic income has a criteria of adequacy that means thresholds. But few months later, the chairperson of the organization, Tony Walter, declares our definition is their definition is without threshold, and he criticized the need-based definition, and also he published a book to criticize the use of the concept of need in general. So, and I don't go in why Philip changed. Well, change is not good word because Philip is an intellectual who also advocate many things and think many things in French. And in French, as far as I understand from my correspondence with Philip, he had initialized allocation universelle in French, and it comes without threshold, so that it's not just one direction change. Initially, he had his own idea with a threshold, and then somehow in several occasions, I didn't say a few other occasions, but there are not only the one I presented, but several other occasions in the mid-1990s, he once accommodates the basic income as having threshold, and then 1992 he changed or went back to the idea, but it was the first occasion he used the term basic income without threshold. So anyway, it's better Philip to explain what was behind, but go back from history to now, today for us. What's wrong with the omission of the threshold from the definition? There are logical rupture, like a penny a month paid unconditionally automatically individually in non-withdrawal manner under the right of citizenship is a basic income if we take a case of CBIT. And the same CBIT say such an income can provide a secure financial platform to build on, enable the employment market to become more flexible at the same time as enhancing security, etc. There are something amiss, logically speaking, and they presuppose some notion of threshold. Otherwise, those arguments cannot stand logically. And also, other issue is, as Philip himself eloquently explained to us, we cannot use full basic income, partial basic income in the usage in the sense we use today, because when a penny a month can be a genuine full basic income fully matched the criteria of being basic income, how 200 times more than £1 basic income, for example, can be called partial. The other reason is the historical revisionism, but I would not go this further. If you're interested, see my paper. And then the political danger. Again, go back to the example of CBIT. They claim we need to replace the present benefit and tax system by basic income, by their definition, which is as low as a penny a month. It can be a very vulnerable, can be dangerous for least advantaged people in the society. And yes, I'm running out of time, so I couldn't go in the detail and discussion what happened in the Seoul in 2016. If you're interested, please see my paper. Let me conclude now. So this paper does not intend to offer any solution to this parallelism, but Philip's distinction between basic income and universal grant in 1989 would be one possible solution. This distinction can accommodate sense of possible merit of negative poll tax type of the definition without ignoring history of the idea and the people who struggled for it. Here, basic income comes with a threshold. The concept with a threshold could be called universal grant or unconditional income or negative poll tax, whatever. We could have different names for different things. And this presentation I only concentrate on either we have threshold or not in the definition, but there are many other things, ambiguity in our definition, and we need to understand more about those kind of things and its connotations. And more fundamental question I would like to raise at the last. Is basic income a purely academically prompted idea, such as political theorists' roles, different principles, or flips and dominated diversity, or Chicago School's economists, negative income tax? They are, yes, kind of invented by one famous scholar or collective of scholars. But, or is basic income a more of a social construct, features of complex origins, not only from ivory towers, but also the many struggles all over the world? And then it's very difficult to one organization such as BN can define this is right, that is wrong, and try to politicize the usage. Like, freedom, equality, people use in a different meaning, and in order to have a rational conversation, we can check in which sense we are using that term. I think in my take of basic income is something similar to those latter cases. Yes, thank you again for your listening, and apologies again, I could not be in Seoul in physical. It's really sad for me, but hope I would have a time to visit there and meet a friend. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.
All right. Thank you very much. I would like to call for a different sort of need. I think to some extent we are asking the wrong question. We've got this phrase, basic income, or its variations, UBI, CBI. We have this phrase that was gaining, so that was been bandied around before '86, but really has steadily gained in usage since this organization was created in 1986. We have this phrase, and we're like, to what concept do we put this very valuable name that's gotten all these positive connotations around the world, thanks in part to the people in this organization? But what we have is we have a discussion related to these ideas, and there are several concepts that are continually coming up in this debate that people disagree about. And we don't just need to say, of all these different concepts, what is the right one to apply our favorite phrase? But what we need is have to realize that we have these many different concepts. These concepts will continue to come up. And what we need is words or phrases for all of them, which is about 6 concepts. There are 2 main things that remain controversial about how we want to define it. Is it large enough to live on or not? The threshold idea. And is it does it vary with income, or does it not vary with income? The definition we're using right now has no threshold, but it does say it is non-means tested. It isn't, and the usual words we use for that. So if under the usual words for that are basic income versus negative income tax, but some people like an income tested version, but they don't like to use that word and they want to use basic income. We need a distinction between the means tested version and the non-means tested version. We also need a distinction for the livable basic income and the sublivable basic income. Sublivable is not a good phrase. And we need a word for one that is, a true basic income and large enough, and a word for one that is either a basic income or a negative income tax, but it meets the threshold. These concepts keep coming up, and we're not going to say, I think to some extent, we're trying to resolve a political debate by a definition. If we say this and only this is basic income, it doesn't mean it doesn't mean it will go away. It doesn't mean people who are making proposals for less than livable basic income aren't going to stop making those proposals because we say, oh, you can't use our word. And as we've certainly learned over the past decades, people who prefer negative income tax are not going to stop doing that because we do this. We need a way to clarify and be friendly and realize that all of these different things are part of the same family. We also need a term for the family. We also need a term for the whole family of these things. So something like guaranteed income or something like that that has no threshold and doesn't distinguish between it, whether it is a uniform payment regardless of income or whether it varies with income. We need a term for that family. And then we need term for the specifics in there. That, I think, is what we need to be thinking about. All right, now, that gives us, our original idea was to have a lot more discussion, but due to scheduling issues, now we have only 9 minutes for a discussion among about 100 people. So, all right, all of them, please. Yes, you're there. Yes, yeah. Right there in the center. Yes, the guy looking around trying to say, oh, you're looking for a microphone. Microphone to the center. Okay, I'll try to get a cue while he's talking. So if other people want to put their hand up.
Thank you very much. So, my name is Olaf Michael Ostertag, and I'm with the Netzwerk Grundeinkommen from Germany, and I would like to congratulate both of the presenters, Annie and Toru, for the in-depth discussion we could have now if it hadn't been for only 9 minutes. Toru, this presentation was absolutely brilliant, and I followed you closely, and I wanted to congratulate you on this in-depth view. And Annie, you know, perhaps that I'm most likely to fall into the pitfall number 2 that you presented on the first day of your opening speech, that I would like to see a basic income with a threshold. But that's not the question that I would like to ask you now. You said about the uniformity criterion, that it is there to, for example, avoid that a married couple or a cohabiting couple gets being financially punished for being together. So isn't the question of whether you are living together or not, isn't that a means test in itself? So it's not only the testing of your income from work or from capital gains or something, but also from the gain of scale, as you said, economy of scale, you told us. So isn't that doing away with something already solved? So without means test, does this need the uniformity criterion still? Because we already had covered that, I thought.
No, I don't think it does, because I think you could, is this working? You could still get couples being penalised unless you have the uniform one. Just having the without means test doesn't stop people being penalised for cohabiting. And I think it is an important one to have. It's a very popular discrimination that's made, and it doesn't help people's decisions about household formation, and fertility levels, for instance, would be affected by this. Be very important. And I just think that it's a very important extra characteristic that we do need for basic income.
Elmaz is next. Yes, that's Elmaz needs mic.
Okay, my name is Alma Zalecki from NYU Shanghai. And just very quickly, the term for the cash transfers that are not basic income is cash transfer, right? Unconditional cash transfers, conditional cash transfers, or just cash transfers in general. I don't think we need another term for one.
Thank you very much for that clarification. I will take that on board.
Next up, Leandro.
So I also want to congratulate Eslaf for this panel and also extend the congratulations to the participants of all the sessions that discussed definitions on basic income, because on every current session we had the same topic being discussed. So I understand that is a collective effort of all of us. I also understand that the concept of uniform is more advanced for what I feel than the threshold concept right now. But I would like to ask, and specifically to you, whether the uniform should also be considered across time, because that has an impact on dividend schemes that vary across time. And the most well-known example is Alaska itself. So Alaska dividend varies across time. Is it uniform across time? Is it uniform for everyone? Because although we can accept that this periodicity for Alaska for 1 year might be a little long, it is periodic, but it's not uniform across time. About the sufficiency, I would just like to add that I would like to see a discussion about a growing sufficiency across the years for the basic income, because it definitely depends on economic conditions that a certain state can afford.
I don't see how you can just fix it at for all time. I don't see why it shouldn't be related to an economy, and that doesn't mean that it has to, say, fulfill basic needs, but it should be related to the economy. For instance, the OECD's poverty benchmark is 60% of equivalized household disposable income for a couple, and it recognizes that it grows over time. I'm using this example for adequacy. In the UK, our social assistance benefits are uprated by inflation, by consumer inflation every year. And so our people are stuck at a level that was appropriate for them about 50 years ago. And the rest of the population has moved on through growth of the population. And I don't see why the population shouldn't enjoy a basic income, which is related to the prosperity of their society.
Okay, last and final question.
So Greg Marston from based in what are we called? Bigger, Australia. It's late in the day, late in the conference. Greg from Australia. So I just wanted, and in relation to the question about citizenship and legality, because, you know, in Guy's definition and other definitions, it talks about citizens. Other definitions will talk about permanent residency, and it can be quite an exclusive category in terms of citizenship with different rights to being a permanent resident. So I think we have to have some clarity in the definition about that as well. Particularly when you're talking about a nation state, typically that's within the boundaries of a particular nation, but we've also got 35 million refugees, 104 million people that are displaced. I think we have to have some clarity around who's included in the we within the nation state, and whether we decide on permanency, that would be my preference, permanent residence rather than citizenship, because citizenship is a high threshold test.
Is that to me?
It's not to me.
Well,
I don't see anybody else here.
this is not part of the definition, but when I talk about this, I say that citizenship is a very complex concept with political, social, and cultural aspects to it, which can be quite difficult to apply. And that's why I just refer to residents. And I think most advocates now refer to residents rather than citizens and citizenship. I've just spent 4 years trying to clarify the definition, and Karl, in 5 minutes, you've just managed to muddle it all up again. Thanks a bunch.
All right, so I wish we had hours more to talk about this. Well, not. Oh, it's Toro's there. Oh, Toru, you're here. You are in fact alive.
Hello.
Hello, are you alive?
Hear me?
Are you alive?
Just 30 seconds to answer Greg's question. Yes, it's how we understand universal, and my personal take is not citizenship, but as same as Annie, it shouldn't be included in the definition, and how we interpret the what universal means is to be open, not included in definition. That's my take, and in the spirit, I'm with Greg. Thank you, and thank you all. 감사합니다.
All right, well, a conversation that will go on till the end of time. All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And we have one more final session in this conference. Thank you, Annie, Toru, and Louise, wherever you may be.